Okay, this lecture we are going to talk about diabetes, and this is hopefully a special population or a health consideration that you have thought about and learned about in the past, so maybe some of this will be review for you. The learning objectives for this lecture is to be able to describe the differences between the major types of diabetes, discuss the risk factors and complications associated with prediabetes and major types of diabetes, identify the diagnostic criteria for prediabetes and the major types of diabetes, describe treatment strategies for diabetes, including common medications, and then lastly, explain how lifestyle management and self-care strategies impact the prevention and management of prediabetes and the major types of diabetes. So let's just start with a big picture, right? As of 2015, so not too long ago, more than 30 million Americans, which represented just less than 10% of Americans, had diabetes, with large increases expected in the next 2 decades. And what's even scarier is that many people are unaware that they have diabetes. So approximately 7.2% of American adults were not aware, as of this time, 2015, that they had diabetes. Another 84.1 million Americans, which is about 11%, were unaware that they had prediabetes, right? So this is really important to consider, is that not only is this that we have this population with a high prevalence of diabetes, but that there potentially is even more who don't know that they have it. And if they don't know that they have diabetes, then we can't treat them and help them to prevent other comorbidities. So we know that there's also a large financial impact of diabetes, just like there is with any other chronic disease. So in 2012, diabetes costs were about $245 billion in the US alone. And this is comprised of $176 billion from direct medical costs, $69 billion from indirect costs, so things like premature death and work loss and disability. And 25 to 45% of those costs are spent treating complications. So it's not just diabetes itself, but complications related to diabetes. And so one of the things that we need to think through as health coaches is that it's not just the prevention of diabetes, because yes, that's important, but once someone does have diabetes, how can we help limit their chances of having these complications? So what are some risk factors for developing diabetes? The first is family history, physical inactivity, overweight and obesity, high blood pressure, abnormal blood lipids, high percentage of abdominal fat, that's really important, and smoking. But what we know is that diabetes can be managed, right, with limited changes in health and well-being. So if we know that diabetes can be managed by changing our lifestyle habits, the health coach can really play an essential role so that we can help improve our clients' health and well-being. So blood glucose is the primary sugar in bloodstream, which you all know, right? And for most humans, we really want that to be in a narrow range, but for people who have diabetes, it's particularly important that that blood glucose is within that normal range or narrow range so that they can have optimal health and function. And glucose is really important because it fuels our brain, it helps our nervous system and our muscles and other cells. And so when it's in that proper range, it's really, really helpful. When it goes outside of that range, then it can be damaging to our system. So what happens with normal blood glucose regulation is that we eat foods, and let's think about primarily carbohydrates. Those are digested, and when they're digested, they're broken down into glucose and then released into the bloodstream. And so when blood glucose levels rise because we've eaten something, 2 things happen. One, the pancreas senses this, and so as a result, it releases insulin from its beta cells. So we eat something that has carbohydrate in it, our pancreas says, oh, hey, you just ate some glucose, so we're going to release some insulin so that our beta cells are going to help us release insulin, and then that's going to help us take that glucose and put it into the muscle and store it as glycogen and or put it into fat. And that's actually the second step. So insulin binds to the cell receptors in the muscle and the fat, and that acts like a key, and that allows excess glucose into the cells to be stored as glycogen. Okay, so again, we don't want just high levels of glucose in our bloodstream And so what happens is our pancreas releases some insulin from the beta cells, and then what that does is it kind of unlocks that ability so that we can then store it into our muscle as glycogen or store it into our fat. And then when that's not working properly, that is what causes an issue, right? And so that's exactly what happens. So the impacts of diabetes on blood glucose regulation, two things happen. The pancreas is no longer able to kind of release the proper amount of insulin, so it reduces the capacity to release insulin, or insulin does not effectively work to unlock the cells and remove excess blood glucose from blood. So that's what we think of and term as insulin resistant. So somebody might still be producing insulin. So that first process, the pancreas is still producing it, beta cells are still working, but they become insulin resistant. So even though they're producing the insulin, they're not actually able to use it. So they're not able to effectively work with the cells that are actually what kind of open up it so that the glucose can go into the adipose tissue as well as the muscle. So let's pause here and do a quick little learning recap. How many Americans have diabetes and what percentage of them are aware of it? I'd also kind of like you to know what percentage of them are aware of having prediabetes. What are the risk factors associated with diabetes? And then lastly, what happens when blood glucose levels rise above normal levels? What are the two things that can happen? Okay, we'll pause here and I'll see you for the next lecture.